Mimesis by Omar Cuellar. In the quiet town of Brattleboro, Vermont, in the year 1980, lived Jacob, a middle-aged man whose existence seemed to unfold without any major disturbances. He was an ordinary individual with a predictable routine. He worked as a clerk in a small local hardware store, lived in a modest wooden house on the outskirts of town, and spent his afternoons reading the newspaper or walking through the nearby woods. At first glance, his life was the very at the time of normalcy in a rural American community. Yet what Jacob did not know, and what no one in Brattleboro could even imagine, was that his reality was nothing more than an illusion, an artificial construct created by forces beyond human comprehension. Jacob had never paused to question the small anomalies that dotted his daily life. For instance, he would sometimes find tools in the hardware store that he did not remember ever seeing before, objects with strange shapes and functions impossible to decipher. At other times, while walking through the forest, he would notice shadows moving in unnatural ways among the trees, as though the wind were shaping them into forms that belonged to nothing earthly. Still, he simply attributed these oddities to fatigue or imagination, shrugged them off, and carried on with his life without further thought. What Jacob was unaware of was that his brain no longer resided in his body. At some undetermined moment, the Migo, entities of superior intelligence from the far reaches of the cosmos, had abducted him. These beings, known for their insect-like appearance and incomprehensible technology, had surgically removed his brain with a precision that defied the laws of human biology. His physical body, if it still existed at all, had been discarded or preserved somewhere unknown, while his mind had been transported much farther away, to the planet Yuggoth. Yuggoth, a dark and frozen world located at the edges of the solar system, was the home of the Migo and the center of their cosmic experiments. There, inside a containment chamber made of translucent, pulsating material, Jacob's brain floated in a viscous fluid that kept it alive and functional. The Migo had developed advanced technology that allowed them to connect extracted brains to complex simulations, perfect replicas of their victims' original environments. In Jacob's case, the simulation was a meticulous recreation of Brattleboro, Vermont in 1980, designed to duplicate every detail of his former life. The Migo's purpose was clear: to study the behavior and thought patterns of other species across the universe. By placing brains in simulations of their natural habitats, they could observe reactions to specific stimuli, problem-solving abilities, and how subjects processed reality. In Jacob's simulation, the Migo had deliberately introduced illogical elements, small cracks in the world's logic, that should have alerted him that something was terribly wrong. To their surprise, however, Jacob showed no signs of suspicion or curiosity in response to these anomalies. In the hardware store, for example, the Migo caused a hammer to appear with a handle that writhed like a living snake. Jacob picked it up, used it to drive a nail, and then placed it back on the shelf without so much as a frown. In the forest, the dancing shadows sometimes emitted guttural sounds like whispers in an impossible language, but Jacob simply adjusted his scarf and continued his walk. From their observatory on Yuggoth, the Migo recorded each of these reactions with a mixture of fascination and bewilderment. Jacob's simulation was not unique. On Yuggoth, thousands of brains from different species floated in similar chambers, each immersed in its own artificial world. The Migo had perfected this technique over eons, using the collected data to deepen their understanding of the universe, and perhaps for darker purposes no human could imagine. Yet Jacob's case was beginning to stand out, not because of its complexity, but because of his absolute passivity. Weeks, months, perhaps years passed. The time in the simulation bore no exact correspondence to real time, and Jacob still showed no sign of questioning anything. The Migo intensified their tests. One morning, the sky above Brattleboro dawned with two suns, one red and one blue, shining in perfect synchrony. Jacob stepped out of his house, looked up, and merely muttered to himself that the weather was strange that day before heading to work. On another occasion, a customer in the hardware store spoke to him in a language of clicks and buzzes, and Jacob replied politely, "Sure, here you go," as he handed over a bag of nails. The Migo began to debate among themselves. Some argued that Jacob's mind was defective, incapable of perceiving inconsistencies due to some inherent flaw in its neural structure. Others suggested his lack of reaction was a form of passive resistance, though they could not prove it. What was clear was that Jacob did not fit the profile of a useful subject for their experiments. His apathy toward the illogical made him an enigma, but also a waste of time. Meanwhile, inside the simulation, Jacob continued his monotonous life. Each day was a repetition of the previous ones, with the Migo's anomaly serving as the only disruptive element. What the Migo could not see, what their technology could not detect, was the undercurrent in Jacob's mind. Though he appeared indifferent on the surface, deep inside, he had begun to suspect that something was profoundly wrong. It was not the kind of suspicion that drove him to investigate or challenge his reality, but rather a quiet, resigned certainty. Jacob had noticed the impossible tools, the living shadows, the strange skies. But instead of reacting with wonder or fear, he deliberately chose to ignore them. He did not do so out of ignorance or inability, but for a much deeper reason. He sensed that questioning those anomalies would keep him trapped. If he showed curiosity, if he tried to unravel the mystery, those watching him, whatever they were, might decide he was worth keeping. And Jacob did not want to be kept. In his mind, Jacob had reached a tacit conclusion. He was a prisoner. He did not know how or why, but he felt his life no longer belonged to him. The oddities surrounding him were tests, traps designed to provoke a reaction. And if he reacted, if he showed interest, he would be playing his captor's game. So he chose the opposite strategy, to pretend nothing was wrong, to act as though everything were normal, even as the impossible unfolded before his eyes. The Migo, unaware of this motivation, interpreted his behavior as a failure. To them, a subject who did not respond to stimuli was useless. After a long period of observation, they made their decision. Jacob's brain would be destroyed. There was nothing more to learn from him, no valuable data left to extract. On Yugoth, the machine sustaining his simulation began to shut down, and the fluid surrounding his brain slowly started to drain. In the simulation, Jacob was sitting on the porch of his house, watching a sunset fade into impossible shades of purple and black. Suddenly, the world around him began to disintegrate. The trees dissolved into dust, the house collapsed as though made of ash, and the sky shattered into fragments like a broken mirror. Jacob did not move. He simply closed his eyes and waited, a faint smile on his lips. On Yugoth, the Migo watched as Jacob's brain ceased emitting signals. The now dry, lifeless organ was removed from the chamber and discarded in a biological waste repository. For them, the experiment was over, and Jacob was just another failure on their long list of subjects. Nothing in their records suggested they had been manipulated, that their decision to destroy him had been exactly what he wanted. What the Migo failed to understand, what their cosmic intellect could not grasp, was Jacob's silent cunning. On some instinctive level, he had realized that the only way to escape his mental prison was to make his captors destroy it themselves. Questioning the anomalies would have prolonged his torment and given the Migo reason to keep him alive for further experimentation. But by ignoring them, by rendering himself useless, he had forced their hand. When the simulated world collapsed, Jacob felt no fear or pain. In his mind, the fading of reality was a liberation. He did not know what lay beyond, if anything at all, but he was certain it was better than the cage in which he had been trapped. His final sensation, before everything went dark, was one of triumph. He had won, not through force or cleverness, but through calculated patience and the willingness to let go. On Yuggoth, the Migo continued their experiments, oblivious to Jacob's victory. To them, he was just another brain, another discarded data point. They never suspected that, in his apparent passivity, Jacob had found a way to defy them. His story, though unknown to the universe, stood as a testament to human resistance, even in the face of the incomprehensible. Meanwhile, in Brattleboro, Vermont, time marched on. The hardware store kept operating, the forests whispered with the wind, and the townspeople's lives remained untouched. No one noticed Jacob's absence, because in the true reality, he had vanished long before. His house stood empty, his name forgotten, as though he had never existed. Across the cosmos, the Migo continued harvesting brains, weaving simulations, seeking answers to questions no human could formulate. Yet somewhere in their vast archives, Jacob's case remained an unresolved anomaly, a faint echo of a mind that had slipped from their control without them ever realizing it. And so Jacob's story ended not with a burst of revelation, but with a subtle silence. He had played his part, endured the impossible, and found his freedom in destruction. In a universe filled with cosmic horrors, his small act of defiance served as a reminder that even prisoners can sometimes choose their fate, even if that fate is nothingness. April 2nd, 1980, according to the simulation's calendar, marked Jacob's end. But in the mind of the one who conceived him, his legacy lived on as a paradox, an ordinary man who, without fully knowing it, had outwitted the insectoid gods of Yuggoth. And perhaps in that irony lay his true victory.